Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The train that never stops. Growing up, my family lived near an old abandoned railway that cut through the forest behind our house. The tracks were rusted and overgrown with weeds, and no trains had run on them for decades. My parents warned me not to play near the tracks, but as a kid, the allure of exploring something forgotten was too tempting to resist. One summer evening, while playing near the tracks with my friend Marcus, we heard a faint sound in the distance. The distant whistle of a train. "That's impossible," Marcus said, frowning. "These tracks haven't been used in years." But the sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel. We stared at each other, unsure of what to do, before ducking into the bushes to watch. Moments later, a train appeared around the bend. It was massive and black, its sleek cars gleaming faintly in the fading light. Smoke billowed from its chimney, curling into the evening sky. The train's windows were dark, but the faint outline of figures inside sent a chill down my spine. They were still, unmoving, like mannequins seated in rows. The train didn't slow as it approached, its whistle piercing the air. It barreled past us with a rush of wind, the ground trembling beneath our feet. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone, disappearing into the forest as if it had never been there. We ran home, breathless and terrified. When we told my parents, they dismissed it as a prank or an overactive imagination. But I knew what we'd seen, and Marcus swore he'd heard stories about the ghost train that haunted the old tracks. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of the whistle again. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as the faint clatter of wheels reached my ears. It was louder this time, closer. I crept to the window and peered out, expecting to see the train in the distance. Instead, I saw its headlights cutting through the trees, coming directly toward my house. The whistle blared, deafening, as the train passed just beyond the backyard. The windows were still dark, but this time, the figures inside weren't seated. They were standing, pressed against the glass, their faces pale and hollow, their mouths stretched into silent screams. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The train returned every evening after that, its whistle echoing through the forest. My parents claimed they never heard it, but Marcus did. One night, he told me he was going to follow it to see where it went. He never came back. The face in the attic. When my parents bought an old Victorian house in the countryside, I thought it was the coolest place I'd ever seen. It had spiral staircases, creaky wooden floors, and an attic that seemed to stretch on forever. My dad planned to renovate it, and my mom was thrilled at the idea of fixing it up. The attic was the one place in the house I avoided. It wasn't the dust or the cobwebs that bothered me. It was the feeling. The air was always colder up there, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. My parents laughed it off, telling me it was just my imagination. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the attic for hidden treasures, I found an old mirror leaning against the far wall. Its ornate frame was tarnished with age, and its glass was coated in a thin layer of grime. I wiped it clean with my sleeve, and that's when I saw it. A face. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even human. Its features were sharp and angular, its eyes hollow and black. It stared at me from the other side of the glass, its lips curling into a faint smile. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a stack of boxes. When I looked again, the face was gone. My own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, a combination of shadows and dust playing tricks on my mind. But the face kept appearing. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow that lingered too long. Then it became more deliberate. I'd see it in the mirror, its gaze following me as I moved. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of it in other reflective surfaces around the house, the windows, the kitchen sink, even the TV when it was turned off. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like a mouse scurrying in the walls, but it grew louder, more insistent. The sound was coming from the attic. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head, but the scratching turned into a low, guttural growl. The sound of something dragging across the floorboards above my room sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, I told my parents, but they brushed it off. "It's probably raccoons," my dad said, promising to check the attic later. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it again, the dragging sound accompanied by faint whispers. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was cold, and the smell of mildew was stronger than ever. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stacks of old boxes and forgotten furniture. The mirror stood where I had left it, its surface gleaming faintly. And then I saw it, the face, clearer than ever, its eyes locked onto mine. It moved this time, its hand pressing against the glass from the other side. The whispers grew louder, filling the attic with a chorus of voices I couldn't understand. The glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I ran, slamming the attic door behind me and locking it. My parents found me trembling in my room, unable to explain what had happened. My dad went up to check, but he found nothing. No mirror, no scratches, no sign of anything unusual. We moved out a few months later. The house is still there, empty and abandoned. But sometimes, when I pass by, I swear I see something in the attic window. A face, staring back at me, waiting for someone foolish enough to return. The forgotten carnival. When I was a kid, there was a stretch of woods behind our neighborhood that everyone said was cursed. Parents warned their children not to play there, whispering stories about strange lights and voices that lured people deeper into the trees. Like most kids, I dismissed the stories as nonsense, until the summer I turned 12. That was the year I discovered the carnival. It was late July, the air heavy with humidity, when my friend Sam and I decided to explore the woods. We brought flashlights and a backpack full of snacks, determined to spend the day pretending to be adventurers. By mid-afternoon, we were deep into the forest, the dense canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. That's when we heard it, the faint sound of music. It was distant but unmistakable, a jaunty tune, the kind you'd expect to hear from a carousel. Sam and I froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks. "Is there a fair nearby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing out here," I said, my stomach twisting with a mix of excitement and unease. But the music grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of voices and the occasional burst of laughter. We followed the sound, weaving through the trees until we stumbled upon it. A carnival nestled in a clearing. The rides were old-fashioned but immaculate. Brightly painted carousels, towering Ferris wheels, and spinning teacups that gleamed in the afternoon light. Strings of multicolored lights hung overhead, glowing faintly despite the daylight. Vendors lined the paths, their carts laden with cotton candy, caramel apples, and popcorn. The strangest part, though, was the people. They were dressed in vintage clothing, like something out of an old photograph. Women in flared skirts and men in suspenders and hats moved between the booths, their faces pale and expressionless. Children ran laughing through the paths, but their laughter sounded off, like it didn't belong to them. "Where did this come from?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my eyes fixed on the Ferris wheel. It turned slowly, its seats empty despite the crowd milling around below. A man in a striped jacket appeared in front of us, his grin too wide. "Welcome," he said, his voice booming. "You're just in time for the fun." Sam and I backed away, but the man's smile only grew. "Don't be shy," he said, spreading his arms wide. "There's plenty for everyone." "I think we should go," I whispered, tugging on Sam's sleeve. But Sam was staring at the carousel. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his eyes glassy. Before I could stop him, he was walking toward it, drawn like a moth to a flame. "Sam," I called, but he didn't turn around. I ran after him, pushing through the crowd. The people barely noticed me, their faces blank and their movements stiff. When I reached the carousel, Sam was already on one of the horses, his face serene as the ride began to spin. "Get off," I shouted, but he didn't respond. The music grew louder, more chaotic, as the carousel picked up speed. The horses moved faster and faster, their painted eyes glinting in the light. Sam's expression didn't change, but his body began to blur, like he was fading into the ride itself. I screamed and lunged for him, but a pair of hands grabbed me from behind. The man in the striped jacket loomed over me, his grin impossibly wide. "It's not your turn yet," he said, his voice low and cold. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the forest floor, the carnival gone. The clearing was empty, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken glass. I called for Sam, but there was no response. He had disappeared. The adults didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They searched the woods but found no trace of a carnival or Sam. The official story was that he had run away, but I knew the truth. Even now, years later, I can sometimes hear the faint strains of carousel music drifting through the trees, calling me back. And though I know better, part of me wonders if Sam is still there, spinning endlessly on that cursed ride. The Forgotten Tenant. After college, I moved into a small apartment in a building that was well past its prime. The walls were thin, the pipes groaned, and the elevator worked only half the time. But the rent was cheap, and I didn't have many options. My neighbor across the hall was an elderly woman named Mrs. Wilkes. She was kind but quiet, always shuffling in and out of her apartment with a faint smile. One evening, as we chatted in the hallway, she said something that stuck with me. "Watch out for the man in 4B, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "There's no one in 4B. It's been empty since I moved in." Her smile faded, and her expression grew serious. "It's better that way," she said. "If you see him, don't talk to him." I laughed it off, assuming she was confused. But a few weeks later, I started hearing noises coming from 4B. Faint whispers, footsteps. and the sound of furniture scraping against the floor. I mentioned it to the landlord, but he insisted the apartment was still vacant. One night, as I was heading to bed, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. The knock came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from 4B. My heart pounded as I approached the door. "Hello?" I called out. The knocking stopped. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, low, gravelly, and impossibly close. "Let me in." I stumbled back, slamming the door to my own apartment and locking it. The knocking resumed, more insistent now, echoing through the thin walls. I stayed awake all night, clutching a kitchen knife and waiting for it to stop. By morning, the knocking was gone, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I asked Mrs. Wilkes about it the next day, but she only shook her head. "He's always been there," she said. "You're better off ignoring him." A week later, Mrs. Wilkes passed away in her sleep. The landlord claimed she had no family, so her apartment was cleaned out quickly. That night, I heard the knocking again, not from 4B, but from my own door. I moved out the next day. But sometimes when I pass the building, I see a shadow in the window of 4B. And though I know better, I can't help but wonder if it's waiting for someone else to answer. The road that loops. There's a road outside my hometown that everyone calls the Loop. Officially, it's just a stretch of 2-lane highway that winds through the woods and eventually connects back to the main road. On maps, it's a perfect circle. To the locals, though, it's more than just a road. It's a trap. The stories varied depending on who you asked. Some said the loop was cursed, that it had been built over sacred ground. Others claimed it wasn't a real road at all, that it existed outside of time, feeding off those who dared to drive it after dark. Most of the stories ended the same way. People who drove the loop too many times disappeared. I thought it was all just urban legend, a way for locals to scare teenagers into staying home at night. That is, until the night I decided to drive it myself. It was a warm summer evening, and my friends and I were bored. We'd exhausted all the usual options, movies, fast food, aimless drives around town, when someone suggested the loop. "Let's do it," my friend Jess said, grinning. "Let's see if it's as creepy as everyone says." "Worst case, it's just a boring drive," added Sam, the designated skeptic of the group. I agreed, mostly to prove I wasn't scared. We piled into Jess's car, her beat-up sedan rattling slightly as we headed out of town. The road was easy to find, a narrow stretch of asphalt cutting through dense woods. At first it seemed ordinary enough. The trees formed a canopy overhead, their leaves rustling faintly in the breeze. The headlights illuminated the pavement ahead, reflecting off the occasional road sign. We joked and laughed, the tension fading as the miles rolled by. But then, something changed. The air grew heavier, the trees pressing closer to the road. The headlights seemed dimmer, their beams swallowed by the darkness. The radio, which had been playing quietly in the background, cut out, replaced by static. "Did anyone else feel that?" Jess asked, her voice uneasy. "Feel what?" Sam replied, though his tone suggested he felt it too. Jess didn't answer. She was staring straight ahead, gripping the wheel tightly. The road seemed longer now, stretching endlessly into the dark. The GPS on her phone had stopped working, the screen stuck on a loading symbol. "We should turn around," I said, my voice trembling. Jess nodded, slowing the car and making a wide U-turn. For a moment, relief washed over me as we headed back the way we came. But then I noticed something strange. The road was the same. The same signs, the same trees, the same bends. It was as though we hadn't turned around at all. The radio crackled, and the static grew louder, almost rhythmic, like a low, distorted heartbeat. "This doesn't make sense," Jess muttered, her knuckles white on the wheel. We drove in silence, the car's engine the only sound. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I glanced out the window and froze. There was a figure standing by the side of the road. It was tall and thin, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Its head was tilted slightly, and its arms hung limply at its sides. As we passed, it turned slowly, its hollow eyes catching the glow of the headlights. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "See what?" Jess asked, her eyes fixed on the road. I didn't answer. The figure was gone. The road stretched on, looping endlessly, the scenery repeating itself like a broken record. The same signs, the same bends, the same trees. Jess drove faster, the car rattling as the speedometer climbed. I could feel the fear in the car, unspoken but palpable. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. Jess slammed on the brakes, and we rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. "Great," Sam muttered, though his voice was tinged with fear. "Now what?" We sat in silence, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air was still, too still, and the static on the radio grew louder, more distorted. And then we heard it, faint footsteps coming from somewhere behind us. "Don't look," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Whatever you do, don't look." I stared straight ahead, my heart pounding as the footsteps grew closer. They were slow and deliberate, like someone or something was taking its time. A faint tapping sound followed, like fingernails brushing against the side of the car. The air grew colder, and I could feel my breath hitching in my chest. The tapping moved to my window, slow and deliberate. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow, its form indistinct but wrong, hovering just outside the glass. I closed my eyes, gripping the seat, praying it would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. The air grew lighter, and the static on the radio faded into silence. Jess turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without a word, she slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as we sped down the road. This time, the trees parted, and the lights of town appeared in the distance. We didn't stop until we were back in Jess's driveway, the car idling as we sat in stunned silence. No one spoke about what we'd seen or heard, but none of us ever drove the loop again. Even now, years later, I hear stories about the road, people disappearing, cars breaking down, strange figures in the woods. And though I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I can still feel the weight of those footsteps, slow and deliberate, following us into the dark. The Lantern Keeper. My grandfather's property bordered a vast marshland, a place he often warned me to stay away from. He called it the Sunken Woods, a tangled expanse of dead trees and thick, muddy paths that seemed to lead nowhere. As a child, I was terrified of it, but as I grew older, my curiosity began to outweigh my fear. One fall evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I ventured out toward the edge of the marsh. The air was cool, and a faint mist curled over the ground, giving the trees an otherworldly appearance. I told myself I wouldn't go far, just enough to see what was beyond the first few rows of trees. The marsh was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft squelch of mud beneath my boots. The deeper I went, the heavier the air seemed to become, pressing against my chest like a warning. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, like the flicker of a lantern. At first, I thought it was someone else exploring the marsh, but as I stepped closer, the light didn't move. It hovered, flickering faintly, as though it were waiting for me. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the thick air. As I approached, I saw a figure standing beneath a dead tree. He held the lantern in one hand, its golden light casting strange, shifting shadows on his face. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes tattered and soaked with mud. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rough, like the creak of old wood. I was just exploring," I stammered, taking a step back. His head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. "This place is not for you," he said. "Turn back before it's too late." The light from the lantern dimmed, and for a moment, the marsh around us was plunged into darkness. When it flared back to life, the man was gone. I ran, stumbling over roots and sinking into the mud, the faint glow of the lantern lingering in the corner of my vision. By the time I reached the edge of the marsh, the mist had thickened, and the trees seemed closer, their skeletal branches reaching toward me. When I told my grandfather what had happened, his face grew pale. "The lantern keeper," he whispered, almost to himself. "You're lucky he let you go." He refused to say anything more, but I didn't need him to. I stayed far away from the marsh after that, but sometimes, late at night, I see the faint flicker of a lantern in the distance, and I know he's still there, watching. The visitor in the window. When I was 10, my family moved into a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was an old, creaky place with wide wooden floors and windows that rattled whenever the wind blew. At first, I loved it. The wide open fields, the sense of space, it felt like an adventure. But then I started noticing the window. My room faced the back of the house, overlooking the fields that stretched out for miles. There was nothing out there. No trees or buildings, just endless grass swaying in the wind. And yet, every night, I would see someone standing outside my window. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure standing in the field, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that the swaying grass was creating shapes that weren't really there. But the figure kept appearing. Every night, it was closer. First at the edge of the field, then halfway across. By the end of the first week, it was standing just a few feet from the house, staring up at my window. Its form was indistinct, like a shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. My dad even went out into the field one night with a flashlight, but he found nothing. "It's just your imagination," he said. "There's no one out there." But the next night, the figure was closer. I started sleeping with the curtains closed, but that didn't help. I could still feel it watching me, its presence pressing against the thin glass. The air in my room grew colder, and sometimes I'd hear faint tapping on the window, like fingernails brushing against it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I woke to the sound of tapping and, against my better judgment, pulled back the curtain. The figure was standing directly outside the window, its face level with mine. It wasn't human. Its features were sharp and angular, its eyes empty pits of darkness, its mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp. It raised a hand, pressing its fingers against the glass, and the window began to frost over, the cold seeping into the room. I screamed, scrambling out of bed and running to my parents' room. By the time they got to my room, the figure was gone, but the frost on the window remained. We moved out a few months later. My parents never talked about what happened, and I stopped asking. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I hear faint tapping on the window, and I can't help but wonder if it followed me. The Whispering Well. There was an old well behind my grandmother's house that she always warned me to avoid. "It's dangerous," she'd say, her voice trembling slightly. "And it's not just the fall you should fear." As a child, I found her warnings vague and overly dramatic. The well was ancient, its crumbling stone sides overgrown with moss, a rusted metal grate covering the opening. It was the kind of thing that seemed more like a relic than a danger. But as I got older, I began to notice the way my grandmother avoided even looking at it, and the unease in her voice whenever she spoke about it. The first time I heard the whispers, I was 13. It was a hot summer afternoon, and I was playing in the backyard. The air was still, the heat oppressive. I had wandered near the well, tracing my fingers over the rough stone, when I heard it. Faint, distant whispers, like voices carried on the wind. I froze, glancing around. The yard was empty, my grandmother inside baking as usual. I leaned closer, the whispers growing clearer. They weren't random. They were saying my name. "Ella! Ella!" My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The whispers stopped instantly, leaving the air heavy with silence. I told my grandmother what I'd heard, expecting her to laugh it off or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, her face went pale. "You didn't answer them, did you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, too shocked to speak. "Good," she said, gripping my shoulders tightly. "You must never answer. No matter what they say, no matter what they promise, you stay away from that well." I tried to heed her warning, but the whispers didn't stop. Every time I went into the backyard, they called to me, soft and pleading. Sometimes they sounded like my own voice. Other times they sounded like my grandmother's. They promised things, secrets, treasures, knowledge. If only I would come closer. If only I would answer. One night, unable to resist any longer, I snuck outside with a flashlight. The yard was eerily quiet, the air cool and still. I crept toward the well, the beam of my flashlight casting long shadows across the ground. The whispers started as soon as I was within a few feet. "Ella, come closer." My heart pounded as I stepped up to the grate, shining my flashlight down into the darkness. The light didn't reach the bottom, but I saw movement, something shifting deep within the shadows. A pale, skeletal hand reached up, its fingers curling around the edge of the grate. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as I stumbled backward. The hand vanished, and the whispers turned into guttural growls, rising in intensity until I thought the sound would drive me mad. The next thing I remember, I was inside, my grandmother holding me tightly as I sobbed into her shoulder. The well was boarded up the next day, and I was forbidden from going near it again. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, I returned to the house to sort through her belongings. The well was still there, the boards rotting and the grate rusted nearly to dust. As I stood there, staring at it, the whispers started again. This time, I ran. The mirror room. The old mansion where I worked as a housekeeper was filled with strange quirks, hidden passageways, doors that led nowhere, and a library so large it felt like it could swallow you whole. But the strangest feature of all was the mirror room. It was tucked away on the third floor, a narrow chamber lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. The mirrors were ancient, their glass clouded and warped, their frames ornately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The room had a suffocating quality, the air always cold, no matter the time of year. My employer, Mrs. Adair, was a frail old woman who rarely left her bedroom. "The mirror room is off limits," she told me the day I started. "You're not to enter it under any circumstances." I nodded, not thinking much of it. The house was enormous, and there were plenty of other rooms to clean. But as the weeks passed, my curiosity grew. I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror room, wondering why it was forbidden. One rainy afternoon, while Mrs. Adair was asleep, I decided to take a look. The door was unlocked, and it opened with a soft creak, revealing the dimly lit chamber. The mirrors reflected the faint light, their warped surfaces creating strange, distorted images. I stepped inside, the air growing colder with each step. My reflection stared back at me from every angle. But something about it was wrong. The faces in the mirrors didn't quite match mine. They moved slightly out of sync, their expressions shifting in ways I couldn't control. As I approached the largest mirror at the far end of the room, I noticed something else. One of the reflections wasn't mine. It stood behind me, a figure tall and thin, its face pale and featureless. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, expecting to see someone in the room. But there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. Its hand reached out, pressing against the glass, and the surface began to ripple like water. I ran, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Mrs. Adair didn't ask why I refused to go near the third floor after that, and I didn't tell her. But sometimes when I passed by the door, I saw faint smudges on the glass of the mirrors, like fingerprints pressing from the other side. The grinning stranger. It happened when I was 15, staying at my mom's house for the weekend. It was just the two of us, as my parents were divorced, and my mom worked late hours. That night she was already asleep while I stayed up in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching TV. The clock read 12:30 a.m., and the world outside the windows was silent. My mom's house wasn't in the safest part of town, but it was nestled far enough from the road to give an illusion of security. I often left the curtains open, enjoying the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the room. It was a habit I didn't think much about, until that night. As I watched the screen, a movement caught my eye from the window nearest me, just 4 feet away. I turned my head, my heart skipping a beat, and saw a man's face staring back at me. He was smiling. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd see in friendly conversation or a passing stranger's nod of acknowledgement. This was something else entirely. A wide, almost unnatural grin that stretched his features into a grotesque mask of malice. For a moment, I froze, locked in a silent exchange of stares with this stranger. Then panic set in. I jumped up, intending to run to my mom's room, but my foot slammed against the edge of the coffee table. Pain shot through my leg, and I crumpled to the floor, gasping. Scrambling to my feet, I yelled for my mom, my voice trembling with terror. She came rushing in, still groggy, but alert enough to understand my stammered words. "There's a man at the window." Before she could process what I was saying, a new sound filled the air, the distinct rattle of someone attempting to open the front door. The locked doorknob jiggled violently, and my mom and I both froze, staring at the door as if sheer willpower could keep it shut. Then her face changed, going pale as realization dawned. "The back door," she whispered. She bolted through the house, her bare feet thudding against the wooden floor as she rushed to the kitchen. I followed her, my injured leg slowing me down as she reached the back door just in time to slam the deadbolt into place. We backed away, our breaths coming in shallow gasps. Outside, the shadow of a figure moved, pausing just beyond the frosted glass of the kitchen door. The handle turned once, then again, before the door shook under the force of a solid kick. "I've got a bat!" my mom yelled, her voice filled with a ferocity I'd never heard before. "I'll kill you if you try to come in here. The police are on their way." The shadow froze. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, slowly, the figure turned and vanished into the night. We stood in the middle of the kitchen, clutching each other as the minutes crawled by. My mom gripped her baseball bat so tightly her knuckles turned white. When the police finally arrived, their flashlights swept through the yard, revealing trampled flowers and a pile of cigarette butts beneath the living room window. The same window where I'd first seen the man. "He was watching," one of the officers muttered grimly, scanning the yard for any further signs. They took my description, but admitted there wasn't much they could do unless he returned. He never did, or at least, not while we were still living there. My mom moved a year later, despite no further incidents. The memory, though, lingered like a shadow over my life. To this day, I can't bring myself to live in a house with ground floor windows. High-rise apartments feel safer, their distance from the street a fragile but comforting barrier. And like my mom, I keep a baseball bat under my bed, just in case. The sound in the basement. My grandfather's house had always felt eerie to me, even as a kid. It wasn't haunted in the Hollywood sense. No poltergeists throwing furniture or creepy ghost children singing nursery rhymes. It was just the kind of place where shadows lingered too long, where floorboards creaked even when no one was walking, and where every noise seemed louder than it should have been. The basement was the worst part. My grandfather used it as a workshop, filling it with old tools, half-finished projects, and shelves crammed with jars of screws and nails. It always smelled like sawdust and damp concrete. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the space, leaving the corners shrouded in darkness. I avoided it whenever I could. But one summer, when I was staying with him during school break, I had no choice but to go down there. He'd asked me to grab a wrench from his workbench while he tinkered with the lawnmower outside. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring down into the gloom, before mustering the courage to descend. The stairs groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the basement. I flipped the light switch at the bottom, but the bulb only flickered weakly before dying completely. "Great," I muttered, pulling out my phone to use as a flashlight. The beam of light swept over the cluttered workbench, catching the dull gleam of the wrench. As I reached for it, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the basement. I froze, the wrench slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was drumming their fingers on the concrete wall. My flashlight beam darted toward the corner, but the light didn't reach far enough to illuminate whatever was there. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing against my ears. Just as I began to convince myself it had been my imagination, the sound started again, closer this time. The tapping turned into a low, guttural whisper, too faint for me to make out the words. The air grew colder, and my flashlight flickered, the beam dimming. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I saw it. A shape moved in the darkness, low to the ground, its limbs impossibly long and thin. It skittered across the floor like a spider, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled backward, barely managing to stay on my feet as I bolted up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut, locking it with trembling hands. My grandfather found me minutes later, pale and shaking. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light, a combination of shadows and my overactive imagination. I refused to go back down there for the rest of the summer. My grandfather laughed it off, but I noticed he started locking the basement door at night, something he'd never done before. Years later, after he passed away, the house was sold to a new family. I sometimes wonder if they've heard the tapping yet, or if they've seen the thing that lurks in the shadows. Part of me hopes they haven't, but another part of me knows it's only a matter of time. The street light. There's a street light at the end of my block that doesn't work like it should. Most of the others flicker occasionally, or hum faintly when they've been on too long. This one, though, doesn't hum or flicker. It turns off completely whenever someone walks beneath it. The first time I noticed, I was walking home late from a friend's house. The neighborhood was quiet, the air cool and crisp. I saw the street light ahead, glowing faintly against the darkness, and thought nothing of it. But as soon as I stepped under it, the light went out. I stopped, glancing up at the darkened bulb. A second later, the light flickered back on, illuminating the empty street. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to bad wiring, and kept walking. It happened again the next time I passed by, and the time after that. The light always went out the moment I was directly beneath it, plunging the street into brief, unsettling darkness. I started avoiding that part of the block, taking a longer route home to avoid the street light. But one night, after a late shift at work, I was too tired to care. I trudged toward it, ignoring the uneasy feeling curling in my stomach. As expected, the light went out as I passed beneath it. But this time, it didn't come back on. The darkness felt heavy, pressing against me like a weight. I turned, squinting into the shadows, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the glow of the next streetlight. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the faint light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, its head tilted slightly to one side. My pulse quickened as I backed away, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Then the figure moved. It took a single step forward, and the streetlight above it went out. I ran. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted toward my house, the streetlights flickering out one by one behind me. By the time I reached my front door, my chest was heaving, and my hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't look back until I was inside, the door locked and bolted. The street outside was dark, every street light on the block extinguished. The light at the end of the street works normally now, or so I've been told. But I still avoid that block at night. And when I see the faint glow of the streetlight in the distance, I can't help but feel like something is waiting beneath it, just out of sight.